Do you have trouble sleeping through the night? Most of the world does, come to find out. These days, I find myself in the company of most of the world. When I was younger, even just 4 years ago, I could sleep under an artillery cannon going off. I would just hit the pillow at the end of the day and awaken refreshed in the morning. Not so much anymore. For whatever reason, age, preoccupation, life transitions, overscheduling, I have become acquainted with those dreaded early morning hours, 2 o'clock, 2:30, 3 o'clock, 3:30. Dreaded, right? It's a killer. Perhaps some of you know what I mean. Still, should we dare, sometimes we can discover God's grace right there in the middle of the night. Those early dark hours are not as ungodly as they may seem, for God sticks by us day and night. In fact, we've just come through this wonderful season of holy and mystical evening encounters with the Lord. Was it not in the dark of night that the angel came to Mary and said, "Hail, O highly favored one"? Also Joseph, God came to him in the middle of the night and says, "I know this is all crazy, just stick with it, it's going to be fine." It was at night that the shepherds were called to go to a hill country and find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothing. And it was at night that the angels told them not to be afraid. And it was in a dream in the dark of night that God spoke to those strange magi from the east, "Do not return to Herod, but go home by another way." Those dreaded early hours can be a drag, but they can also be filled with holiness and grace. Now, we can likely expect that our 12-year-old Samuel from today's first reading didn't have difficulty sleeping through the night. He would have worked long, hard hours in the temple, assisting the high priest Eli with all those sacrifices. Yes, this is the yucky part, sacrifices. It would have been Samuel's job to clean up after all those sacrifices. Burn the carcasses in the back alley and make sure that he's burning plenty of incense to overcome the stench. Samuel did the grunt work in the temple. And so we can expect that when he hit his pillow at night, he slept deeply until the sun rose. In this pivotal moment when God comes to call Samuel in a deep sleep, he cries out, tugging with all his might against that mattress, "Samuel, Samuel." Given that in those days the voice of the Lord was rare, as it says in those opening words, Samuel presumes that the voice must be that of his boss Eli, whom we can presume, being of an age, was probably up at 3 o'clock in the morning balancing his checkbook. Like most teenagers, Samuel wakens, wondering what's going on, and Eli says, "It's nothing, it's the wind, go back to sleep." And Samuel obliges. However, God is having none of that. God has business with Samuel. And so he tugs on his mattress again, "Samuel, Samuel." And with his young ears and Eli's good heart, they piece together that the voice they hear is none other than the Lord's. That rare voice was speaking insistently, personally, and powerfully to Samuel. The only right response, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." In other words, "You've got me, God. I'm all ears." Now, by now, Samuel is wondering why it is that God has bypassed Eli. After all, Eli is the chief priest. He's the primo intercessor to the divine. However, God is not beyond breaking a few rules. God has done that before. No, God goes around Eli and goes straight to the kid. The kid has what he needs: a clean heart, a guileless spirit, an open and willing soul. God needs Samuel and lots more like him with all that goodness to be a voice for hope and change in the midst of an unstable Israel, where the tribes are warring against each other, dragging each other down, where the Philistines are on their backs against a despairing world. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like Samuel, grew up in the house of God. His daddy was a preacher. His daddy's daddy was a preacher, and his daddy's daddy's daddy was a preacher. The church was his warm, soft place. Prayer meetings, church suppers, youth groups, and all-day Sundays flowing with music and prayer and community life. His congregation loved him up. They had his back, no questions asked, and he knew that down into the marrow. I think it must have filled them all with great joy when he too decided to become a minister. And I imagine they swelled with pride that day that he went off to study theology at Boston University. Now, in those days, Boston was, you might say, 1,000,000 miles away from Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, those iconic places where Dr. King lived out his legacy as an advocate for the rights of blacks and all human beings. Boston was not without its racism, but compared to the Deep South, it was a more or less safe place where a young guy who was smart and talented could study and question and fall in love and dream about a life lived in a world that was his oyster. However, after completing his doctorate in sacred theology and getting married, he stepped out of that safe world and went home to the South, accepting the post as senior pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, King had grown up all his days enduring the struggles of a segregated South. However, in 1955, the seams that had sewn that society together were becoming unraveled. People were fed up with a world of walls and violence and oppression. Slavery had been abolished, but racism and the structures that kept blacks tied to a slave-like existence were still in place. King was a young pastor, and coming back to Montgomery, Alabama, the only thing on his mind was his church gig, getting established, making a living, buying a house. He focused his life and his energy on his church work, getting ready for his sermons, visiting the sick, doing pastoral work, attending vestry meetings, dealing with broken boilers and overflowing toilets. Church stuff. However, the world around him was tugging at his heart. The gospel he preached within the walls of that church building each Sunday needed to be brought out into a despairing world. The world needed that gospel love, that gospel power, that gospel truth. It was at this time that the famed Rosa Parks, a social worker from Montgomery, was arrested for refusing to yield her seat on a city bus to a white man. Her act of civil disobedience launched the 381-day famed Montgomery bus boycott. An organization rose up at that time called the Montgomery Improvement Association, convening pastors and civil leaders from across the city. The 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. quickly ascended into leadership of that group and became the heart and voice of a growing movement. The boycott prospered a small victory, with a ruling from the Supreme Court declaring that segregating buses was unconstitutional. Shouts of joy, though, soon turned into shouts of terror as a backlash of violence rained down upon this movement. Now, when the phone rings in the middle of the night, you cannot but think that something terribly wrong has happened. Phone goes off at 2 a.m, and you think, who's died? Who's sick? What's wrong? People don't call in the middle of the night to chit-chat about the weather. This was the call that the King family had been dreading and expecting all at the same time. We're tired of you and your mess. If you are not out of town in 3 days, we are going to blow your brains out and blow up your house. It was a low moment for Martin because in that moment, he looked at his life, he looked at his career, he looked at his family, he looked at all of it, looked at what was at stake, and began to imagine in his head, maybe we should just go back to Boston. Maybe I could get a nice, safe church gig up there. Maybe I could teach. Maybe, let's get out of here. And on his knees, he prayed to God, and he said this prayer: Lord, I am down here trying to do what is right, and I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right. But Lord, I must confess that I am weak, I am faltering, I am losing my courage, and I am afraid. I am at the end of my powers. I cannot face this alone. And there, in the dark of night, that still strong voice of God called out to him, Martin Luther, Martin Luther, do not be afraid. Stand up for truth. Stand up for justice. Stand up for righteousness. I will abide with you always. Like Samuel, he initially shooed away that voice, but it kept coming back because God had business with Martin Luther King Jr. And it came back stronger and deeper throughout that night. Martin Luther, Martin Luther, I will be with you. Stand up and go. With an assurance from God, walking by his side always, Martin Luther went out again that next day, and the next day after that. And the day after they did bomb his house, he went out again, and the day after that. And one day he went out and boarded the Montgomery bus line as the first African American to ride on an integrated bus. But that wasn't the last confrontation. He went out again and again and again. 50 years ago, this April, he went out one last time. They killed him with a gunshot. However, his vision of the beloved community did not die that day. It lives. The vision of a world where people are not judged by the color of their skin, where the dignity of every human person is upheld. However, the dream, the vision, means there is work to be done. Like Samuel, who faithfully served God but did not make every problem in Israel disappear, Martin Luther King Jr. did not eradicate racism. Though we no longer have segregated water fountains in schools and buses and restaurants, we are still in the struggle. It all takes a different shape, a different form. The currents of racism still flow, but as God's children, we are called to stand against that tide in any way we are able. In this Epiphany season, we're going to talk a lot about bringing the light of Christ out into the world. Well, what do you say we not just talk about it? Let's do it. Samuel did his bit, and God was with him. Martin Luther King Jr. did his bit, and God was with him. Now is our time. God arouses us in this dark night and awakens us to go out and be a living church, making the gospel felt and known. When we walk through the waters, God will be with us. And though the rivers may rise, they will not engulf us. God will never leave us alone. Never, even to the ends of the earth. Amen.